this guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
A.G. Hogan, thank you for another depressing and dismal report. I'm going to start by quoting the AG's opening comments from the Emergency Services report, which was equally as dismal. She stated, Sheila Fraser, former AG, summed up her impression of Indigenous Services Department's actions after 10 years of audits as unacceptable. Keep in mind, this is 2011. She continues, 5 years later, which is 15 years after the original audit, Michael Ferguson, Auditor General at the time, used the words beyond unacceptable. A.G. Hogan herself then continues, we're now into decades of audits of programs and commitments that have repeatedly failed to serve Indigenous people. Now onto this report, I quote the AG, this is the fourth time we have raised concerns about housing. And 20 years later, many of these concerns persist. Indigenous Services and CMHC have made little progress to improving First Nations housing conditions. Now, I asked this question when you were here with us, Ms. Wilson, for the Emergency Services disgrace, I will use those words, is why should we not be calling for the termination of yourself and all the other executive from your department? Repeated failures, all we hear back is there's much more to do.
So First Nation housing shortages and overcrowding have been widely publicized for many years.
Do you take any accountability for this?
We take responsibility for this program.
Do you take any accountability or responsibility for this?
I take responsibility for this, yes.
Let me ask you, I'm looking at your departmental results from last year. And to quote from the government site, departmental results inform parliamentarians and Canadians of the results achieved by government organizations for Canadians. Your department achieved 16.9% of your targets. And yet 94% of your executives, I assume yourself, received an average of $18,000 in bonuses for achieving less than 17%, and 2 disastrous audits. Now I'm looking at your DRR's results. Percentage of First Nations housing that is adequate as assessed and reported annually by First Nations. You set a target of 75%, achieved, unspecified. The date to achieve that unspecified goal was March of last year, so no target set. Under self-determined services, percentage of First Nation housing that is adequate as assessed and reported by First Nations. Target to be determined, so no target set. Actually achieved, unspecified. Date to achieve the unspecified, untargeted number, unspecified. Under the housing program, percentage of First Nation housing that is adequate as assessed and reported annually by First Nations. A target of 75%. What did we actually achieve? From your own department, reported through Treasury Board, unspecified. And at least you set a date of March 23rd to achieve your unspecified results. Now these are from your department's own targets set in your departmental plans, which I will read to you. Departmental plans describe priorities, strategic outcomes, programs, expected results, and associated resources requirements. So you come to this committee, present estimates, justifying the money that you're looking for based on these targets, and yet you've set no targets, and you can't even measure the targets that you haven't set. And yet somehow everyone got bonused $18,000, and we have probably the 2 worst audits I've seen, and I've been through maybe 30, 40 audits. How do you sit here and not offer anything to us? Like, when are we actually going to see action? This goes back to 2001. And I realize there's a minister responsible, but you were deputy minister. You could actually set results, and yet we don't even have targets. How are we going to move forward with you still in this position? Because I don't have confidence that we're going to achieve anything that the AG is putting out with the current team here or the current minister here either. How are we going to achieve this?
Mr. Chair, if I can. I'd like to talk about that this for the next 2 hours, actually, is explain some of the context around this and actually explain some of the context around indicators and how we develop those indicators and co-develop them with First Nation partners.
Actually,
Well, representative. So I get that the fact that there's a question that's being asked, but I can't hear a word from those because the person who's asking the question keeps talking over the witness.
Thank you. I can hear. I recognize. I think
Put on
there's
a
going to,
headphone
I think there's going to be some give and take here. It's not got to the point where it's unruly yet. I will ask Mr. McCauley to. You have a series. Do you want the floor back, or
I
do you
will
want
take the floor back. It is my time.
You are going to take the floor. Just. Okay, hold on. So having said that, I do expect it's going to be somewhat. There's going to be a bit of back and forth today. So I would, members, of course, it is your time. You can use all that time. But if you do pose questions, if you're able to allow some time for responses, of course you will want to police that they are not answers that take too much of your time. I do appreciate that as well. Mr. McCauley, you've got 50 seconds left.
Justify to Canadians this committee how 94% of the executives of your department receive bonuses despite achieving 17%. And tell us, how is it you have a departmental plan going forward without targets set or dates set on how you're going to achieve it, and you don't even know what you've achieved for the past year?
So if I can talk about executive bonuses, departmental plans set out broad, high-level program targets, and individual employees use specific criteria to provide individual commitments and key commitments. So to draw a parallel between a broad departmental target not being met and an executive bonus just doesn't actually apply to the Treasury Board policy of how bonuses are provided. It doesn't. So I follow those policies of the employer, and others may have views about those policies.
Thank you. That is your time.
there's been a notable shift between the approach this government has taken compared to previous governments when it comes to programs and services for Indigenous peoples, and one more focused on self-determination. Can you give us a sense of how its approach to housing investments and programming has changed since 2015, and what are the next steps to further self-determination?
Thank you for the question. I would probably point to partnership as a response to that question. I think, as noted in the Auditor General's report, we were proud to work with the Assembly of First Nations and all First Nations in the establishment and the adherence of the 2018 Assembly of First Nations Housing and Infrastructure Strategy, and that was developed in partnership with First Nation, as to was the application and the formula for the aforementioned housing management subsidy. That was done in partnership. And I think, as Deputy Wilson mentioned in her opening remarks, ultimately the management of housing affairs is the purview and is the right of First Nations, and we are proud supporters of First Nations in those self-determined affairs and an investor in those affairs. And last year, the fiscal year that just ended just a few days ago, was the most ever that this department spent in infrastructure, and we are on track to spend more this year.
So in relation to the Indigenous service de-evolution process, does ISC recognize that the de-evolution process itself can in fact be harmful should there not be an agency, whether it's the First Nation or the department, that's able to actually monitor the material loss or material gain to their communities during devolvement?
That's an institution I'd be more than willing to hear more about. I'm not aware of a particular agency that
Your agency is set to devolve.
You're talking about ISK devolving and transferring.
Yeah, and there's a loss of material wealth during that process. How do you explain that?
There's a loss of material. I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Go ahead, Mr. Ajay, you can ask it again.
I'll ask it. They're losing money because they've been asked to sign agreements that look at de-evolution, and they have lost the opportunity to have ISC, formerly INAC, continue to monitor their lost houses.
Okay.
So, you know what I'm saying? There's a gap there.
Yeah.
That's why the gap's growing. It's because devolvement.
I get your question now, but I think we'll need more time to respond to it.
Of course.
Do you have a response? Yes. Oh, no, go ahead.
We have some good examples of where we could do that. So, Nelson?
Go ahead, please.
I appreciate the question, and thank you. In terms of transfer, we don't call it de-evolution, we call it in transfer Indigenous Services Canada. It's baked into the mandate of the department as part of the legislation. We currently have 13 active tables around transfer, and these are tables that are dictated and mandated by rights holders themselves. And so that process begins with assessing the gap, much like the work that we did with the AFN in determining what the gap is in the report that you cited earlier. So the example I think that we often refer to, and one that we've talked about at this committee before, is the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority. That was a partnership to understand the water needs of Atlantic First Nations, the regulatory gap, and also the funding needed. And there was direct funding support to the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority to the tune of $173 million in recognition of that work. So I wouldn't say transfer is about a way of exacerbating the gap. I think it's about, to your point,
Cherry picking some of these examples is
now,
not
Mr. Digital,
appropriate.
the other side of my rule is if you
No, I
ask a
understand the rules,
question
Chair.
after the
I
time is
just can't
allotted,
accept
I
that.
tend to end things.
Minister Haidu likes to blame previous governments for a lot of the failures, but 2 years ago, she in 2022. Here I'll quote her. Unfortunately, successive governments have not prioritized housing for Indigenous peoples. As a result, Indigenous peoples are more likely to live in overcrowded homes, experience higher rates of all kinds of challenging, including mold and other poor housing conditions. That was just about on the nose of 2 years ago. In the Auditor General's report, we have heard that the mold strategy seems to be completely forgotten, completely abandoned. However, it seems that the minister seemed to know about it at least 2 years ago. Could ISK explain why there's no action happening on the mold front and why they don't seem to be worried about it?
Well, Mr. Chair, there is action on mold, and there was a mold strategy. It was replaced by the current programming, which does allow for mold remediation. So mold remediation is underway, and Dr. Wong can talk about some of the efforts there. And it doesn't. We've seen that it was preferable in the spirit of self-determination to include the funding for mold directed to communities so they decide their priorities.
Was it ever communicated to the public that the mold strategy was being abandoned in lieu of something else?
Wasn't formally communicated to the public. It was worked through with First Nations.
Okay, so it still shows up on your departmental plans. Is there any efforts to do something differently?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I will make my remarks first and then turn over, to Nelson Barbosa, my colleague, who's responsible for housing funding, including repairs and remediation for mold. Mold, from a health standpoint, it's a major concerns from a public health standpoint.
I understand that. I'm going to just move on from I'd just like to go back to the Auditor General, just if she could explain a little bit around, maybe I'm misunderstanding the change, and so if she could just clarify perhaps, did she understand that the program had been replaced by something else?
So our understanding when we were doing the audit is that no one could explain to us why the mold strategy wasn't being used anymore, and that access to funding to deal with mold is part of a bigger, broader repairs program that exists there. Now, this is an issue that my office raised in 2003, which recommended the creation of the strategy. I think strategy or no strategy, it comes back to understanding the magnitude of the mold issue so that it's properly, you understand the dollars needed and the support needed by communities in order to address it. And so whether you don't have a strategy or you have something else, you still need to understand the magnitude. And I think it goes back to first not having the data to know the extent of the problem, and then not having a plan to try and fund it and address it going forward, whatever you want to call it.
Okay. I was just wondering, how many employees does ISK have dedicated to housing?
Let me get that data for you here. Yeah, I think you have it. Yeah.
We can provide the committee more specific numbers, but I can say in Budget 22, Indigenous Services Canada received $2.4 billion for programming related to housing remediation in First Nations, and associated with that money was, it's with that money was 77 employees.
Okay.
2.4 billion equaled 77 employees.
Okay. Do you know how long it takes to build the average housing unit through ISK?
It can vary greatly. And typically, these happen seasonal in the summer season, and which links into winter roads. So typically, that happens within a year.
Okay. Per unit. It takes a whole year to produce one unit.
It varies greatly. The one unit is a measure of a geospatial home, but some houses are small, some are big, some take a year, some take longer.
Some take 2 months.
Yeah. There are some that are prefab that happen immediately. Communities are using technology like 3D printing, which happens much faster. That is their prerogative.
What number does ISK use for the population growth of the folks that you service?
Sorry?
What is the number of what number for population growth are you using?
Yeah, so we use Statistics Canada data through the census and most recent census data.
How often do your staff go out to inspect these sites to see the condition and how the progress is coming along?
I would say with our funding services officers that liaise quite daily with First Nation communities, along with our regional housing managers and regional infrastructure staff, we're looking at a daily kind of ongoing engagement that is quite fluid but very close.
Maybe I could just add, so all of our contribution agreements that include this type of funding do require final completion reports that are certified by a qualified inspector. And so we've been working with the First Nations National Building Officers Association to build that capacity as well as to do training and those sorts of things. Thanks.
So the AG's report identified that there was limited assurance of compliance with building code standards, that they lacked the necessary supporting documentation, and that CMHC did not require proof of building code compliance for housing repair programs. Why would that be?
That all of our programs on reserve, the two programs subject to the audit, are actually the parameters of the programs do require an inspections to be done. We, for the new constructions, you also have to take into account that the period under the audit was during a global pandemic where travel was restricted. So a 90% achievement is a very good rate in our opinion. The other thing I would say is that First Nations communities have no benefit of building and having non-standard or non-code compliant repairs or new builds done.
Thank you, Chair. My sole question will be to Indigenous Services officials. I have one question. I am the member for Brant. I proudly represent 2 Indigenous nations, 6 nations of the Grand River, Mississaugas of the Credit. I trust at least someone on this panel has probably visited my riding from time to time. So I want to talk about an issue that has been plaguing my tenure as a parliamentarian, as well as my predecessor, Mr. Phil McColman. I wrote a letter to Minister Haidu on December 21st, 2001. It read, "The Gawaweni School is a federally funded elementary and secondary school located on 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. For the past 30 years, the school has provided instruction to its students in the Mohawk and Cayuga language in grade 8, at which time English is introduced. There has been an application for funding in progress for several years for a new school to be built. The school is currently operating out of a privately owned lacrosse arena, and their need for a new building is urgent. The landlord has been extremely accommodating. However, the lease is subject to annual renewal. Therefore, the space is not secure and, most importantly, certainly not adequate for a school. The classrooms are cramped with no running water, and the majority do not have windows. The language instruction not only provides the students with an education, but also the foundation for their identity. No doubt you will agree that providing financial support for the construction of the school will also help to fulfill our collective commitment towards truth and reconciliation, most specifically the preservation and revitalization of Aboriginal languages and cultures. Minister, in short, the current facility is not acceptable and, more importantly, not safe for the students and staff. They have been without a proper school for over 30 years. It's been long enough. The school has the support of 6 Nations Council and a shovel-ready project which should be funded. I look forward to your reply." Well, I didn't get a reply. I had to follow up with Minister Haidu on April 22nd, 2022, reminding her that my staff reached out to her office on March the 10th, 14th, and 28th with no response. This project is now just under $30 million to properly fund. When we were asking for federal funding, the cost was just over $10 million. Because of Justin Trudeau's inflationary policies, we have now almost tripled the cost. Justin Trudeau has spent close to $21 billion on consultants, but can't seem to find the money to fund this particular school. Today, I had the chair, Ruby Jacobs, crying to my constituency office saying, what does it take to finally get the Government of Canada to recognize the need to introduce this school, to have the funding there, to have the school learn in a proper environment? What are you going to tell my constituents? What are you going to tell the parents of the children? What are you going to tell the chair who is crying? When are we going to receive the funding?
So thank you for the question, and I am aware of the situation, and I will certainly follow up with
Not good enough. Not good enough.
My colleagues in education.
We've been waiting for 7 years for this government to write a check. That is not an appropriate answer. When are they going to receive funding? 3 years ago, actually 2.5 years ago, Minister Miller attended on site. We had the press there. We had all kinds of stakeholders there. We were thinking that Minister Miller was going to deliver that long-awaited check. All that Minister Miller had to say was, "I'm sorry, I don't have the best news for you. Be patient. We are working on it. There are other priorities in our department, but you will eventually receive the funding." That was almost 2.5 years ago. When will you write the check?
So it's not my check to write, but I will follow up with the officials under whose program this fits. We do run schools at Six Nations. That is not the only school in at Six Nations.
Why doesn't your minister, this is to Ms. Wilson, why doesn't your minister, Minister Haidu, have the professional courtesy to respond to members of Parliament who are duly elected to represent a number of Indigenous nations? Why do I have to plead and beg for a response? This is shameful, it is disgusting, and I hope you relay the message directly to her, how disappointed I am in the way that she conducts her ministry.